So now we're going to start creating the production cost report. And here's the data we need. We will start with a production cost report for the assembly department. The first step for preparing the production cost report is summarizing the flow of the physical units, which are the actual puzzles being made. So here is the information we need for the assembly department for the month of July. To show the flow of physical units, it may be easier to visualize the flow if we have a T account for the assembly department's work in process inventory account. Looking at our data, notice we don't have any units whatsoever in the beginning work in process at the beginning of July. So in our T account, we place the beginning units here. The assembly department did start 50,000 puzzles throughout the month. So in our T account, we place the started units here. And throughout the month, 40,000 puzzles were completed and transferred to the next process, which was the cutting department. In our T account, we place the completed and transferred units here. Now we can calculate the ending balance. Mathematically, we had a beginning balance of 0 units plus 50,000 units started minus 40,000 units transferred out. So how many units are in our ending balance? 0 plus 50,000 minus 40,000 units gives us 10,000 units in the ending balance. Remember, they are still in process at the end of the period because they are incomplete units. So the units to account for are the units in the beginning work in process, which was 0, plus the units that we started throughout July, which was 50,000 units. So we have to account for a total of 50,000 puzzles or units. And next we have to show where those puzzles went. This is the accounted for amount. As we learned earlier, accounted for is the units transferred out plus the units still in process. 40,000 units were transferred out to the cutting department, and 10,000 puzzles were still in process in the assembly department at the end of July. This gives us 50,000 units accounted for. Remember, units to account for and units accounted for have to be the same number. In this case, 50,000. So now we can fill out the first part of our production cost report, which is in the lower right corner of the screen. Notice this report is only for the assembly department. Very simply, it shows the units we have to account for and units accounted for. Starting with units to account for, we can now fill in the beginning work in process in whole units, which was 0. Next, we fill in the units started in production during the period, which was 50,000. Then we fill in the total number of units to account for, 50,000. Then we move on to units accounted for, which starts with units completed and transferred out, which was 40,000, and add to that the number of units incomplete, in other words, the ending balance of units. Then we add completed and transferred out units to ending work in process units, and we get 50,000 total units accounted for. Remember, units to account for and units accounted for have to be the same number. So to summarize step 1 of the production cost report, it shows units we have to account for. So we take the beginning work in process units and add that to the number of units we started, giving us the total number of puzzles we have to account for, 50,000 units. And where did those puzzles go? Well, 40,000 were transferred out to the cutting department, and 10,000 puzzles are still in the assembly department, partially completed as of the end of July. Now we move on to step number 2. Computing output in terms of EUP, equivalent units of production. First, we need additional data. So let's talk about what happens within the assembly process. The assembly department of Peggy's Puzzles adds all direct materials at the very beginning of the process. This is a key point, the beginning of the process. The direct materials used in the assembly department for Peggy's puzzles include cardboard, pictures, and glue. To help us visualize this, let's look at a timeline of the process. You can also think of this as a conveyor belt that runs from left to right. Puzzles start at the far left, where they are 0% complete. They move through the timeline or conveyor belt from left to right and are 100% complete when they reach the far right. Some processes add the direct materials at the very beginning of the process, like this company. But some processes add direct materials at the middle, some processes add direct materials at the end, and some processes add the direct materials evenly throughout the process. So each process could be different. But the assembly department for this company adds the direct materials at the very beginning of the process. That's key. So that means, for example, that if the ending work-in-process units were halfway through the assembly process, that means they already have all of the direct materials applied to them because this particular department applies the materials at the beginning of the process. In fact, if the ending work-in-process units were only 1% through the process, they would all have had 100% of the direct materials applied to them because the direct materials for this process are added at the beginning. This is important when we calculate the equivalent units of production for direct materials. But the conversion costs are a different matter. Remember, conversion costs are simply direct labor plus manufacturing overhead. Conversion costs are usually applied evenly throughout the process, and that's the case with this department. That means if the 10,000 ending work-in-process units were halfway through the process at the end of the period, then that would be the equivalent of 5,000 units being fully completed for conversion costs. 10,000 times 50%. So we must calculate two items. EUP, equivalent units of production for direct materials for the assembly department, and the equivalent units of production for conversion costs for the assembly department. They must be done separately because direct materials and conversion costs are added at different times in the timeline. Before we start with equivalent units of production for direct materials and conversion costs, let's quickly talk about the equivalent units transferred in. Since the assembly department is the very first process, there are no units transferred in from a previous department because there is no previous department. Therefore, we can put NA, which means not applicable, for completed and transferred in, ending work in process, and total units accounted for. Now let's concentrate on the EUP, equivalent units of production, for the 40,000 units completed and transferred out. The 40,000 units came from the data table and were placed on the production cost report in the Units Accounted For section. Since these 40,000 units were transferred out of the assembly department, this means the assembly department is completely done with these 40,000 units. That means they are considered 100% complete for both direct materials and conversion costs. So to calculate the equivalent units of production for the 40,000 completed and transferred out units, we simply take 40,000 units times 100% since they were completely finished, and we get 40,000 EUP for both direct materials and conversion costs. Now we simply place the 40,000 EUP on the production cost report for both direct materials and conversion costs. Now we will calculate the equivalent units of production for the 10,000 units that were the ending work in process units. Remember, this means they were unfinished. So now we need to know how far through the assembly process were these units. Was it 70%? Was it 50%? Well, to find this out, we just need to consult our data table to find out that these 10,000 units were 25% complete at the end of July. So let's visually add them to the timeline in the upper right corner. So let's talk about direct materials first, then conversion costs later. For direct materials, at what point on the timeline did the direct materials get added? You can also think of the timeline, remember, as a conveyor belt with a starting point on the left and the puzzles moving to the right. Remember, our additional data says the direct materials are added at the beginning of this department's process. So the question is, of these 10,000 incomplete puzzles, what percentage of them have had the direct materials added to them? Well, since all 10,000 units are 25% through the process, and the direct materials were added at the beginning of the process, 100% of the puzzles have the direct materials added. So our calculation is 10,000 units that were incomplete at the end of the accounting period times 100% equals 10,000 equivalent units of production for direct materials. Now we simply place the 10,000 EUP on the production cost report for direct materials. Then for the direct materials column, we add the 40,000 EUP with 10,000 EUP to get a total of 50,000 EUP for direct materials. Now we will calculate the equivalent units of production for the conversion costs for the 10,000 units in ending work in process. Remember, these units were 25% complete per our data table. Also remember that conversion costs are added evenly throughout the process per our additional data. So, since these 10,000 units were only 25% complete and conversion costs are incurred evenly throughout the assembly process, to calculate equivalent units of production, we take the 10,000 incomplete units and multiply by 25% to get 2,500 equivalent units of production for conversion costs. Now we simply place the 2,500 EUP on the production cost report for conversion costs, then add 40,000 for the completed units to the 2,500 for the incomplete units to get 42,500 total EUP for conversion costs. Now we are done with the hard part of the production cost report. The rest is pretty much simple arithmetic.